At the annual partner review, I smiled and slid my project portfolio across the conference table. Daniel barely glanced at it before clearing his throat. The senior partner position is going to Celeste. Gordon nodded like the decision had been made weeks ago. Celeste was already waiting outside those glass doors in her new blazer. The one she'd asked me about last month, whether it was too formal for a pitch meeting. I told her it was perfect. What I did after I walked out of that boardroom, nobody in that firm saw coming. I had rehearsed none of what happened next. 9 years of carrying Vantage Architecture Group on my back. And I stood in front of those floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Toronto waterfront with my portfolio still in my hands, waiting for someone to correct the room. Nobody did. My husband, Daniel, finally set down his phone. He had the particular expression he used during difficult client calls: measured, apologetic, already calculating the exit strategy. The board felt the Harbourfront Centre file needed fresh energy going forward, he said. Celeste brings a different perspective. Fresh energy. The Harbourfront Centre redevelopment was my file. Every structural concept, every sustainability integration, every meeting with the Heritage Toronto Committee where I'd spent 3 separate Saturdays arguing the case for retaining the original facade. The proposal that had won us the $47 million contract sat in my portfolio, time-stamped, signed, mine. Patricia, who had been with the firm since before Daniel and I married, caught my eye from the far end of the table. She looked away immediately, which told me everything I needed to know about how long this decision had been circulating before I walked into that room. I set the portfolio down quietly. I'll need the afternoon to hand off my active files. Celeste appeared in the doorway exactly on cue, her new blazer pressed and deliberate. No rush, she said, her voice carrying a warmth that hadn't been there 6 months ago. Daniel has been briefing me on the key accounts. For the past 6 months, while I was in Ottawa for the Federal Heritage Project Review, while I was at the Ontario Association of Architects conference presenting the very research that had built our firm's reputation, Daniel had been preparing her to take my place. The drive home took 24 minutes on the Gardiner. I counted every red light between the lakeshore and our neighborhood in the annex, the kind of street where you bought a semi-detached when you were building something permanent together. The kitchen renovation we'd been putting off for 2 years. The back porch that still needed a structural assessment. All of it waiting, as if the house had always known it was temporary. I set my box of belongings on the dining room table and noticed Daniel's sketchbook open on the kitchen island. The handwriting in the margins wasn't his careful block print I'd recognized for 11 years of marriage. These were quick, looping annotations Celeste's handwriting, which I'd seen on meeting agendas enough times to know. Notes about the Westfield Properties pitch. Client relationship details I had spent 2 years building. My strategies, captured in someone else's hand, dated back 9 weeks. My phone buzzed. Owen, at the University of Toronto for his 2nd year of engineering. How did the review go, Mom? Did they finally make it official? I stared at that message for a long time. The OSAP loan statements on the counter. The co-signed line of credit. The promises we'd made about his tuition while I had apparently been too focused on my work to notice my own career being quietly disassembled around me. The house felt like a set. I had been performing the role of the supportive wife in the background of Daniel's story for so long I had started to believe it was mine. I opened my laptop and began documenting. Not my achievements, those were already documented, time-stamped, and backed up on the firm's server. This list was different. Every project file, every client contact, every proprietary methodology I had developed that the firm had absorbed without attribution. Passwords. System access. The structural analysis templates I had built from scratch in 2019 that every junior architect now used without knowing who had created them. I was still at the laptop when Daniel came home at 7:15. He loosened his tie in the kitchen doorway and asked what was for dinner with the same tone he'd used every Thursday for 11 years, like we were running through a comfortable script. I set down my pencil. We need to talk about this afternoon. He exhaled the particular way that suggested I was misreading a professional decision. The board had concerns about perception. Vivian, a managing partner pushing his wife into senior partnership, it looks like nepotism. It undermines your credibility and the firm's. My credibility. The Harbourfront file. The Federal Heritage Review. The $47 million contract that had tripled our firm's profile in 18 months. All of it undermined by the idea that my husband might be helping me. I almost laughed. Not the brittle kind, but the genuine kind, the kind that surfaces when an argument is so precisely constructed to be your fault that it almost earns admiration. You sat across from me every night while I rehearsed that presentation, I said. You listened to me revise the sustainability framework 6 times over dinner. You read my full proposal 2 weekends ago and told me the cost-benefit modeling was the strongest work I'd ever done. He moved past me to the refrigerator. I was protecting you. You have no idea what people say about us, about how you got where you are. I got where I am because I built the practice area that generates 40% of this firm's annual revenue. The doorbell cut through whatever he was preparing to say next. He crossed the house before I could and opened the front door. Celeste stood on our porch in a quilted vest and running shoes, holding his laptop in both hands. She had taken the long way from the office. Our street in the annex is not on any reasonable route between Vantage's King West office and any gym in the city. Her smile when she saw me was calibrated perfectly between warmth and discomfort. I noticed you left this in the boardroom, she told him, not me. You mentioned the Westfield pitch is first thing tomorrow. His hand covered hers briefly in the exchange. The gesture was small and specific, and it was not the first time it had happened. About the Westfield deck, she said, finally shifting her eyes to include me in the conversation. Should I use Vivian's framework or start fresh? He answered without hesitation. Fresh. We want a new approach for this one. She nodded and turned to me with the practiced sympathy of someone who had prepared for this exact moment. I'm sorry about today, Vivian. These transitions are hard, but I think you'll see it's for the best. Not an apology. A closing statement. I smiled. The same smile I had perfected in rooms full of clients and municipal planning committees present. Composed, revealing nothing. Of course, Celeste. Safe drive home. After she left, Daniel tried to call it professionalism. I was already walking upstairs. In the closet, I pulled out my carry-on, the one we'd taken to Montreal for our anniversary 3 years ago. The luggage tag from the Hotel Nelligan was still clipped to the handle. I almost felt sorry for the person who had packed it that weekend. What are you doing? He stood in the doorway like a question he already knew the answer to. Getting some space to think. He told me I was being dramatic. I held a sweater Owen had given me for Christmas and told him very calmly that there was nothing dramatic about a husband orchestrating his wife's professional replacement while that replacement dropped by our home in activewear to hand him a laptop she could have emailed the password for. He stayed downstairs most of that night. I lay awake doing arithmetic that wouldn't balance. 9 years of work. 11 years of marriage. 8 months of watching Celeste get quietly inserted into every client relationship I had built and not once having the instinct to ask why. By Friday morning, I had my answer. The automated IT message arrived at 6 a.m. Remote access suspended pending administrative review. I had my personal laptop open and a client correspondence archive downloading before the firm's system could lock me out. The download bar moved slowly across the screen. Project files, structural reports, client intake records, the full revision history on every major proposal I had written since 2016. An email thread stopped me cold. Daniel to Celeste, marked internal, sent 10 weeks ago on a Saturday night. I had been in Ottawa for the federal file. Vivian is too personally invested in the heritage projects to see the scalability problem. She treats clients like relationships instead of accounts. We need someone who can run this at volume. Let's talk timeline over dinner, Riverdale. Riverdale. I remembered that Saturday. He had told me he was reviewing quarterly statements at the office because the junior associates needed guidance. The download finished just before the screen went dark. I had what I needed. I scrambled eggs and took screenshots at the same time, maintaining the surface of a normal Saturday morning while the marriage dissolved in real time around the kitchen island. Daniel came down, pretended to read the Globe and Mail on his tablet, said nothing about the night before. Both of us performing roles in a production that had already closed. My brother, Marcus, called before I could finish my coffee. He had seen my LinkedIn update about exploring new directions. I almost laughed at the timing. He told me to drop the corporate phrasing and tell him what actually happened. When I explained, he went quiet for a moment, then said, "Actually, Viv, I need to tell you something. Back in July, I was at Canoe for a client dinner and I saw Daniel at a table near the back with a woman, red-haired, younger. They were laughing at something and he had his hand on the table near hers. I assumed it was a business thing. I should have called you." Canoe. The private dining room at the top of the TD Tower, where reservations run 3 weeks out and the back tables are specifically requested by people who don't want to be seen from the entrance. In July, I had been in Hamilton for the heritage site assessment. I thanked my brother and told him I'd explain everything soon. I spent that weekend transforming our dining room into an investigation. The table where we had hosted Daniel's colleagues and my university friends became a landscape of evidence sorted into 3 piles. The first, Celeste's expense claims from the past 8 months, client dinners at restaurants none of our clients were based near, conference registrations for events in Calgary and Vancouver that our internal calendar showed no one attending, hotel receipts that matched nothing in the project's schedule. $36,000, all approved personally by Daniel, all outside our firm's standard reimbursement process. The second pile, my proof of authorship. Every Harborfront document with creation metadata intact, version histories, revision notes in my name going back to the first site assessment in 2021. The Westfield pitch deck Celeste had apparently been developing since September. I had built the original template in January of that year and refined it through 14 versions, each one saved and time-stamped. The third pile made my hands stop moving. Building access records I had downloaded months earlier for an efficiency audit I'd never submitted. Because when I opened the file I found something else. Daniel and Celeste's key fob entries into the executive floor. 7 separate Saturday evenings across 4 months. Always on weekends I was traveling for the federal file. Always leaving within an hour of each other well past midnight. My phone buzzed past 11 p.m. Owen. Mom, your texts have been one-word answers for 3 days. I'm coming up from residence tomorrow. I told him to wait. He came anyway. He stood in the doorway of the dining room on Sunday afternoon and looked at the table the way a structural engineer looks at a load-bearing wall that shouldn't be where it is. Is Dad having an affair? Among other things. With Celeste. He wasn't surprised. He said she had been at our Christmas dinner 2 years ago and had called Daniel by a nickname Owen had never heard anyone else use. I wanted to ask why he hadn't said anything. He answered before I could. Because you seemed happy. Because I kept thinking maybe it was nothing. He sat down at the table, picked up a stack of the access records, and said, "This is not nothing." Owen spent the next 2 hours building an encrypted folder on my laptop and setting up a secondary cloud backup through his university account. He was quiet and precise and 20 years old, and I had never been more grateful for anything in my life. Monday morning, I made 3 phone calls. The first was to Patricia Okonkwo, who had left Vantage abruptly 8 months ago with a settlement agreement that included a very specific confidentiality clause. She agreed to meet at a cafe on Ossington, far enough from King West that we wouldn't run into anyone from the firm. She was wearing her own work, now a small heritage consultancy out of a shared office in Kensington Market, doing the kind of careful, considered work she'd never been allowed to do at Vantage. She told me that when she flagged irregularities in the cost reporting on 2 commercial files, Daniel had told the board she was obstructing process. Her departure had been framed as a mutual decision. She pulled out a USB drive and set it on the table between us. The second call was to Claire Beaumont, former director of client relations at a competing firm who had worked briefly with Vantage on a joint proposal before resigning without explanation. She met me in her car in a parking structure on Adelaide. Her hands were steady on the wheel even though her voice wasn't. She gave me a folder with records of 6 client accounts showing work billed and credited to Celeste that Claire had documented as having been produced entirely by other team members, including me. The paper trail went back 14 months. By the time I got home, I had enough to act. But evidence without strategy is noise. I spent Monday evening writing to the Ontario Association of Architects Ethics Committee. 17 careful drafts. Not accusations, professional concerns. Patterns requiring review. Documentation of attribution irregularities on publicly funded heritage projects. The OAA takes attribution seriously. They are required to. Tuesday, I sat down with my brother and explained everything. He referred me to his colleague, a labor and employment lawyer at a firm on Bay Street. She reviewed the confidentiality clause from my partnership agreement and confirmed that because the clause had been structured to prevent disclosure of financial irregularities which the law in Ontario does not permit, it was unenforceable in its current form. She also noted that Daniel's email, the one calling me too personally invested sent while he was actively training my replacement, constituted documented evidence of bad faith management. Owen drove up from residence again on Wednesday, this time with his laptop and a better VPN. We worked until 1 in the morning, cross-referencing access records with expense reports, building a timeline. He said at one point, "You spent 9 years making that firm what it is." He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. Thursday brought a phone call I had not anticipated. An unfamiliar number. I answered on the fourth ring. The voice belonged to Nathaniel Cross, Director of Design Strategy at Meridian Build, Vantage's largest competitor in the Ontario market. He said he had heard through channels that I was assessing my next move. He said they were expanding their heritage and civic practice and were specifically looking for someone with federal project experience. He did not ask if I was interested. He said he assumed I was and wanted to know when I could meet. I stood in the parking lot of the Loblaws on Bloor with rain collecting on my coat and negotiated a package I would never have dared name inside Vantage's walls. Principal position. Equity stake after 18 months. The specific ability to approach any client who initiated contact about transitioning their account. Nathaniel said he could have the offer in writing by end of week. I said yes before he finished the sentence. The OAA Ethics Committee notification went out Thursday evening. The email to Gordon and the board went out at 11:43 p.m. Concerns about attribution practices on publicly funded projects, patterns of financial irregularity requiring independent audit, evidence attached. I closed the laptop and went to sleep for the first time in a week. I woke to 17 messages. Owen's text started at 8:22. Emergency partners meeting. Celeste came in and went straight to the 4th floor. Building access is restricted. Patricia told me the OAA compliance coordinator was asking questions. The client liaison for Harbourfront Heritage Trust had called the main line asking specifically to speak with me and being told I was no longer with the firm. I called Robert Whitfield at Harbourfront Heritage Trust directly. Robert was meticulous and unhurried and had been in Toronto heritage preservation since before most of Vantage's junior staff were born. He said Celeste had introduced herself that morning as the lead on their account. She had been unable to answer his question about the Phase 2 environmental assessment we had submitted in September. She had suggested he wait for a follow-up. He was not interested in waiting. He asked if I was available to continue the work independently or through a new firm. I start at Meridian on Monday, I told him. They would be very interested in continuing the Harbourfront file. The pause on his end lasted exactly 3 seconds. Good. I'll be in touch with Meridian by end of day. I was still on the phone with Robert when a message came from the Westfield Properties contact asking why their account rep had changed without notice and who specifically at Vantage had authorized the switch without consultation. 2 hours later, a message from the city's planning department liaison noting that their primary point of contact on the Heritage Review Committee had not been notified of any staffing transition and requesting immediate clarification. Every client relationship I had built over 9 years had my fingerprints embedded in it, not metaphorically. Literally in the version histories, in the email threads, in the site assessment reports where my signature sat at the bottom of every recommendation they had built their trust on. Celeste could present herself as their new account lead. She could not present herself as the person who had earned that trust. Daniel came home at 7 that evening looking like a man who had spent the day watching a controlled demolition he thought he had designed. Discover it had been running on a different timer the entire time. He walked past Owen, who was sitting at the dining room table with his laptop, and looked at me with an expression that had moved past anger into something closer to vertigo. The Harbourfront client is threatening to pull the contract, he said. Westfield called Gordon directly. The OAA compliance coordinator wants original project documentation going back to 2021. I said I hoped the firm had maintained thorough records. Aurora, he stopped. He had used the wrong name. An old habit from somewhere. He corrected himself and the correction landed harder than the mistake. You've cost us everything we built. I cost you nothing, I said. I built what you took credit for and handed to someone else. Those are different things. He sat down at the kitchen table, which still had Owen's structural engineering notes spread across one end. He looked older than he had a week ago. The board is launching an audit. Gordon says 2 partners are reconsidering their investment positions. The Fletcher project financing is contingent on Harbourfront staying clean. The Fletcher project financing I had structured. The preliminary due diligence I had completed across 3 weekends last spring while Daniel was at a partner's retreat I later noticed had no agenda and no hotel invoice in the firm's expense system. I placed a printed article on the table in front of him. Catherine Marlowe at the Toronto Star's business section had been investigating attribution practices at mid-sized architecture firms for 6 months. I had spoken to her off the record. The piece would publish Friday. No firm names, no individual names, but anyone in the Ontario architecture community would read it and know exactly who and what she was describing. Owen looked up from his laptop. He said nothing. He didn't need to. Daniel read 3 paragraphs before his face changed color. He said he would pursue legal action. I told him my lawyer had reviewed our partnership agreement and the confidentiality provisions, and that he was welcome to explain to a judge why a clause designed to prevent disclosure of financial irregularities should be enforced. He had nothing left, not a reframe, not a deflection, not the quiet authority he had always counted on. He sat in the kitchen of the house we had bought together and had no more moves. I went upstairs and finished packing. Monday morning in November, Meridian Build's offices in the Mares district felt like walking into a different version of the last 9 years' same city, a same lake visible through the same kind of floor-to-ceiling glass, but none of the performance required to stand in it. My office was on the 8th floor. Actual walls. An actual door. A name placard on the desk that said Vivian Marsh, Principal, Heritage and Civic Practice. Nobody's wife, nobody's supporting role. Just my name and the work I had done to earn it. My new assistant knocked at 9 and handed me a printed copy of the Harbourfront Heritage Trust's transition letter, officially moving their file to Meridian. Westfield Properties followed by noon. The Star's story ran online at 6 that evening and in print Friday morning, and by the following Monday I had 9 messages from former colleagues at other firms, all variations of, "I didn't know others had gone through the same thing. Thank you for giving this a shape." The divorce paperwork arrived 6 weeks later. Daniel wanted the annex house. I kept my RRSP accounts, my pension contributions, and the inheritance I had refused to commingle despite his suggestion 11 years ago that it showed a lack of commitment. His equity position in Vantage had lost 40% of its assessed value since the OAA audit opened. The firm's 2 anchor clients had followed me to Meridian. The Harbourfront contract, worth more than any single file Vantage had carried, now ran through my desk. I signed every page of the divorce documents at the same table where I had spread the evidence. The pen was the same one I had used to pack my box that Thursday afternoon. I didn't plan that. I noticed it after and thought, yes, exactly. Owen stayed for the weekend I signed. We ordered from the Thai place on Dundas West and ate on the floor of the apartment I had moved into in the distillery district, smaller than the annex house, every square foot mine. He helped me hang the OAA Merit Awards that had lived in Daniel's garage because he had said they cluttered the walls. They looked right here. He put down his fork at one point and told me he had started the legal process to take Clark as his middle name. I asked why. He said Clark was my name before. He said he wanted to carry the name of the parent who had taught him that the work you do is the only thing that actually belongs to you. My throat closed and I let it. He was 20 years old and he had already understood something that had taken me 9 years and a very specific kind of loss to learn. 8 months later, I was asked to speak at the Ontario Architecture Symposium in Ottawa, 1,200 professionals. The theme was ethical practice and institutional accountability. I had spent 4 months building the presentation and I knew, from the seating chart I received the morning of, that Daniel was registered as an attendee. I stood at the podium and looked at a room full of people who made the same choice every day I had been making for 9 years, to do the work precisely, to document everything, to believe that excellence would be seen. I told them they were not wrong to believe it, but that believing it was not enough. I told them that meritocracy in practice is not a default setting. It is a structure that has to be built and defended, that can be quietly dismantled by the people with signing authority if nobody is watching. I did not mention Daniel. I did not mention Celeste. I did not mention Vantage. I didn't have to. The room knew the story behind the lesson. The standing ovation ran 4 minutes. Afterward, in the corridor outside the main hall, my phone showed a text from Daniel. A request for 5 minutes. An explanation he needed to give. I deleted it without responding and walked toward the reception table where a young woman was waiting, holding her program and clearly deciding whether to approach. Her name was Priya. She was 31, a senior associate at a firm in Mississauga, and she had been passed over twice for a file lead position that had gone each time to a colleague with a personal relationship with the managing director. She had documented everything. She didn't know what to do with it. I found a quiet corner near the windows. The Ottawa River was gray-green in the November light. "Tell me everything," I said. She talked for 30 minutes. Her story had different names, a different city, a different specialty. The same fundamental architecture, someone building and someone else collecting the credit, and an institution that had decided not to notice. I wrote Nathan Cross's direct number on the back of my business card. I told her that Meridian had an opening in their municipal projects group and that I would send a note. I told her to document every outstanding file in a personal archive before she made any move. I told her that leaving a place that has decided not to see you is not retreat. It is resource allocation. She looked at the card for a moment. She asked if it really worked out the way I had described in my talk, or if I had softened the hard parts for the audience. I thought about the months of arithmetic that hadn't balanced. About Owen eating takeout on the floor and handing me back a version of my own name. About the morning I sat in the Meridian parking lot and pulled out my old partnership agreement and realized I had been negotiating against myself inside Vantage for the better part of a decade. "It works out," I said. "Not because it gets easier. Because eventually you run out of patience for the performance, and you start doing the work in a room where the work is actually what matters." She folded the card into her jacket pocket and shook my hand. I flew back to Toronto on the 8 o'clock flight and watched the city rise up through the cloud cover, the lake, the islands, the downtown towers catching the last of the evening light. Nathaniel Cross had texted that afternoon. The Westfield development had been shortlisted for a National Design Award, and the nomination specifically cited the Heritage Integration Framework. My framework. My name, properly credited, in the nomination document. The city below looked the way it always had. I was different in it now. Not harder, that's not quite right. More exact, maybe. More willing to take up the space the work had already earned. Owen was waiting outside arrivals in his old Civic with the heater already running. He handed me a coffee without being asked, dark roast, no sugar, and asked how the talk had gone. I told him about Priya. He said that sounded about right for her. I asked what he meant. He said, "You always figure out the ending and then go find whoever's still at the beginning." We drove home along the lake shore. The city lights made long lines in the water, and I thought about the dining room table covered in evidence, and the first morning I drove to the Meridian parking lot, and the luggage tag still clipped to the carry-on from Montreal, and the pen I had not planned to use twice but did. If this story found you at a moment when you needed it, hit like and let me know. My favorite part was the moment I stopped making the case for my own value to people who had already decided what I was worth and started building somewhere that didn't require the argument. If you've ever made that decision, I want to hear about it in the comments. And if you're still deciding, I hope this helped. Subscribe and stay close. There are more stories where this one came from.